A bloke died at 40, his kidneys stuffed from morphine, and his dreams turned to ash. They found him on a sleeping porch in California, surrounded by unfinished manuscripts and debts he owed. Jack London had worn himself out from writing, knocking out 50 books in 17 years, chasing a fortune that always just slipped through his fingers. But that's not where the story gets interesting. What's fascinating is how a kid born out of wedlock in the slums of Oakland ended up the highest-paid writer in the States. Then he destroyed everything he'd built, because he couldn't stop running from a truth he'd found out when he was 21. On the 12th of January, 1876, in a boarding house near 3rd and Brannan Streets in San Francisco, a woman called Flora Wellman gave birth to a kid. The dad was nowhere to be seen. He'd never be there. William Cheney dabbled in astrology and journalism, a bloke who reckoned he could predict fates from the stars. But somehow, he couldn't see his own fate when Flora told him she was pregnant. He insisted she get rid of it. She said no. According to an article in the San Francisco Chronicle published months before the birth, Cheney denied he was the father and took off. Flora, devastated and hopeless, put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger. The shot missed, or maybe she aimed wide on purpose. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is she stuck it out, gave birth, and within a few months married a completely different bloke. John London, a partly disabled Civil War vet, found it tough getting by in a city that didn't give a toss about wounded soldiers. He took in Flora and her illegitimate son and gave the kid his last name. Jack London didn't inherit that name at birth. It was given to him, and that difference mattered a lot. But Jack wouldn't get the full picture until he turned 21 and decided to dig up the truth about his biological dad. That search would break something essential inside him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The household moved around a lot. First Oakland, then a cheaper place, then an even cheaper one. Later on, Jack reckoned Oakland was the bottom of the barrel of society, and that was no bull. Their places were in slums, where sickness spread through the mob like the weather, and kids died so often that just making it through felt like a win. Jack's stepdad was pretty much crook. His body was shagged from the struggle, and the odd jobs he could do didn't earn much. Flora tried her best to help, but she was all over the place emotionally, and would have these massive meltdowns that freaked her kid out. The one steady presence in Jack's childhood was Virginia Prentice. Jenny Prentice, a former slave, lived just down the road. After Jack was born, Flora got Jenny to feed him, and Jenny ended up being the closest thing to a mum Jack ever knew. Later on, he copped that she taught him what real love felt like, and showed him there was kindness in a world that seemed dead set on crushing anyone born without money or a lucky break. She called him her white kid, and he kept coming to see her his whole life, even after he hit the big time. While everything else in his younger days was chaos and drama, Jenny was the one solid rock. But there was nothing Jenny could do to shield him from being poor. By the time he was 10, Jack had a job. Not just now and then, not for pocket money. He worked because his family needed every bloody cent he could bring in. He flogged papers at street corners and lugged ice blocks up all those steep staircases in San Francisco's hills. At a bowling alley, he'd set up the pins by hand after every frame, while drunken blokes chucked bowling balls at his head. At 14, he worked at Hickmott's Cannery, making 10 cents an hour for shifts that went 12 to 18 hours. Those shifts left his hands bleeding and his mind dead. The cannery was a bloody nightmare you lived through. Try to picture spending your whole teenage years in a joint that stinks of fish guts and chemicals, doing the same boring movement thousands of times a day, surrounded by grown-ups who've given up on everything except just getting through the shift. Jack said it was like being a working beast, and he saw what it did to the blokes. It completely wore him out and turned him into nothing but machines that just happened to need food and rest. He watched blokes who once had dreams turn into lifeless shells. With bloody, scary clarity, he realized this'd be his fate if he didn't find a way out. He was saved by the Oakland Public Library, or more specifically, by a librarian called Ina Coolbrith. She saw potential in this rough, dirt-poor kid. He'd show up with grubby hands and devour books with the same enthusiasm that other kids had for lollies. She guided his book choices, recommended authors, and kept pushing him to keep up his education. She'd eventually become California's first poet laureate. But back in the 1880s, she was just a librarian who believed a kid from poverty deserved the opportunities that reading could open up. Jack devoured every bit of writing he could get his hands on. At age 9, he stumbled across a copy of Ouida's novel, Signa, which he later said was the start of his writing dreams. His reading wasn't just for fun. It was both an escape and a way to make sense of things. He read to figure out how society worked, and understand why some folks lived in mansions while others slogged away in canneries. Through books, he learned his world wasn't fixed or inevitable. It was made by people and could be changed. But books couldn't pay the rent. At 15, Jack made a call that would shape his whole future. He borrowed some cash from Jenny Prentice and bought a schooner called the Razzle Dazzle off an oyster fisherman named French Frank. He turned into a criminal, Not a small-time one, but a full-blown pirate. He stole oysters from commercial oyster beds in San Francisco Bay. He'd sell them at markets and earn in one night more than a week's pay at the cannery. This work was dodgy. The law was always after pirates, and rival pirates would knock you off over territory disputes. Jack was a standout. Quick, smart, and fearless in a way that rattled more experienced blokes. After a short stint as a pirate, he switched sides. He joined the Fish Patrol, the same mob that had been after him to arrest him before. Now he was enforcing the very rules he used to break. He chased other oyster thieves and saw both sides of a seriously flawed system. This experience showed him a basic truth about authority and law. Justice wasn't really the point. It was more about who had the power to call something legal or illegal. At 17, he signed on with the Sophie Sutherland, a seal hunting vessel heading for Japan in the Bering Sea. The year was 1893, and Jack was about to have an experience that would change him more than any book or brawl. The trip was tough. Seal hunting meant killing thousands of seals in cold, wet, and dangerous conditions. The sailors were rough, the work was bloody, and during the Pacific crossing, a typhoon nearly wrecked the ship. Jack got through it. He didn't just survive, he came home with heaps of stories. His mom spotted a writing competition ad in the local paper and pushed him to enter. With only a Year 8 education, Jack wrote a piece about the typhoon and the fear of dying at sea. He entered and won first prize of $25, beating students from Berkeley and Stanford. For a kid who grew up in canneries, this was a revelation. Writing could earn coin and offer a way out, but to take that path, he first had to learn a worldly lesson that no book could teach. By 1894, the nation was in a bad economic crisis, with widespread unemployment and serious hunger. A group called the Industrial Army gathered to protest in Washington for government action, and Jack joined them. It wasn't because he had a clearly defined political ideology, but more because he could see the anger and hopelessness in those blokes. He saw a bit of himself in them. They represented all the people he grew up with. He never made it to Washington, because the Industrial Army disbanded before reaching its goal. Jack left the group in Hannibal, Missouri, then spent a few months bumming around on trains, moving from one town to another. He saw poverty so bad that Oakland looked wealthy in comparison. He slept in fields, nicked food when he had to, and realized the whole nation was in deep strife. The country was full of people thrown away by an economy that had no use for him in Buffalo. He was pinched for vagrancy, sentenced to 30 days inside without a trial, no lawyer, and no chance to speak up for himself. Just being poor and homeless was considered reason enough to punish him. That experience really shaped him. He saw violence that still shocked him, despite everything he'd been through in the wilderness. Guards bashed prisoners for petty stuff, blokes being destroyed by a system that dehumanized him. When Jack left that jail, he had a new outlook. The legal system wasn't impartial, and justice was anything but blind. The whole government machine was set up to protect wealth and punish those living in poverty. That realization could have turned him into a revolutionary, and to some extent it did. But it also had another effect. It convinced him his success had to come from inside the system, not outside. After all, he'd lived on the fringes of society. Existing on the fringe was where individuals got crushed and destroyed. To survive and gain influence, to make a difference, he needed to move up socially, get an education, and earn legitimacy. In 1896, after months of hard prep, Jack passed the entrance exams for the University of California in Berkeley. At 20, he was a fair bit older than the usual first-year uni student and dead broke. He was juggling work and study, barely slept, and got by on next to nothing. While he was at Berkeley, he stumbled across ideas that made sense of all the emotions he'd been through. That was Darwin's stuff on evolution and natural selection, Marx's take on capitalism and class struggle, and Nietzsche's writings. When it came to power and the urge to control, these weren't just abstract theories. They explained everything he'd been through. But uni was expensive, and Jack was short on cash because his stepdad was sick, and his family needed financial support. Within less than a year, he had to drop out and never got his degree. Much later, anti-Stratfordians would use this as evidence, claiming that someone with no formal education couldn't have written the works attributed to Jack London. They completely missed the real issue. Jack didn't owe his education to academic teachers. It came from stealing oysters, working in canneries, and 30 days in a Buffalo jail. It came from studying Darwin in a winter camp in the Klondike, while his gums were bleeding from scurvy. But we haven't got to the Klondike yet. Before that, another key piece needs to be added. This piece had to take place when he was 21, still enrolled at Berkeley, and Jack decided to look into his origins. He'd known since childhood that he was born out of wedlock, but the details had always escaped him. He scoured historical newspaper archives and found an 1875 San Francisco Chronicle article describing his mother's suicide attempt and revealing his biological father's identity, William Cheney. Jack sent a letter to Cheney, who lived in Chicago, and the message was careful, almost respectful. Jack wasn't after money or revenge. He just wanted to know and understand his background. And Cheney's reply broke something inside him. The elderly astrologer flat out denied paternity, claiming he was impotent and therefore couldn't be Jack's father. The letter was harsh and dismissive, and Jack's response in the end was drastic. He immediately dropped out of Berkeley. Within a few months, he boarded a ship for Alaska, searching for gold and fleeing a reality that had shattered his identity. This bloke, who'd believed his whole childhood that he was John London's son, had built his self-image as a tough kid from Oakland. All of a sudden, he had no bloody idea who he was anymore. Being a kid born out of wedlock wasn't just about your folks not being hitched. It meant you were unanchored, no roots, dead set isolated in a way that even heaps of success or praise could never properly heal. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 was calling, and Jack London was dead keen to answer. He wasn't going because he reckoned he'd strike it rich. Nah, he was looking for something completely different. What he needed was a reason to push on, when the rest of his life was falling to bits. Out there in that freezing wilderness, he didn't find riches. He found yarns, and plenty of them, as it turned out. Yarns were the only sort of treasure that no one could ever nick off him, but his #1 priority was just staying alive. Traveling and surviving in the Klondike meant copping temperatures that could snuff you out in a few minutes, hunger that turned blokes into animals, and a loneliness that made you wonder if civilization was even real. Jack's Klondike trip kicked off on July 12, 1897 in San Francisco, when he was only 21. He was flat broke and running from a reality he couldn't handle. Captain Shepard, his sister's husband, said he'd take him along. They had no gear, no clue, and only just enough for the fare. But that summer, thousands of blokes headed north by boat. Every one of them was after the same thing: enough gold to turn their lives around. The boat pulled into Dyea, Alaska, a dodgy bunch of tents and pre-made shacks that were barely hanging on at the edge of the bush. It was the entrance to the gold fields and felt like the arse end of the world. From here, the only way was up, and I mean that literally. Up ahead was the Chilkoot Pass, a bloody, enormous wall of ice and rock that cut Alaska off from the Yukon. Jack and his mob grabbed a heap of supplies: flour, bacon, beans, coffee, blankets, and mining gear. Canadian border blokes insisted every fella carry a year's worth of food and gear. Anyone with less got knocked back. That rule made a heap of sense. If you ran out of tucker in the Yukon, you weren't going to make it to tell the tale. Each bloke's supplies weighed more than 1,000 pounds. The track was too steep for horses or carts, so they had to lug everything on foot, making multiple trips. They climbed a 45-degree slope made of ice, mud, and loose rocks. Some blokes copped a fall and lost their gear. A few fellas chucked it in, sold all their gear for peanuts, and headed home before their journey even really got going. Jack carried 100 pounds each trip. His back was killing him, and his legs were shaking. Still, he kept climbing up, hauling supplies, then going back for more. That cycle went on for weeks. Around him, thousands of other prospectors were doing the same thing, creating an endless line of blokes trudging up the mountain and working non-stop at the top. Once they hit Canadian territory, they started coming down the other side. But going down turned out to be just as dodgy, just as steep, slippery, and dangerous. People lost their footing and tumbled hundreds of feet. Jack watched another prospector lose his grip and slide off the track. His screams cut off as he hit the rocks below, and no one stopped to lend a hand. Nothing anyone did could have changed what happened. When they got to Lake Linneman, they knocked together boats, rough, leaky things made from untreated timber. The whole lakeside had turned into a busy workshop, with thousands of blokes sawing and hammering, all racing to finish before winter froze the lakes. Jack had zero experience building boats, and neither did his mates. But you either learnt fast or you didn't survive. After loading their supplies, they launched their boat and joined a fleet of makeshift vessels heading north. Narrow channels and rapids connected the lakes together, mate. Even though boats capsized, blokes died, and gear sank, the march kept going non-stop. Everyone knew that getting to Dawson City before the frost decided whether you could peg a claim or tough out a rough winter with nothing. Jack's boat just barely made it through. They carved their way through Miles Canyon and the White Horse Rapids, dodgy waterways that had already killed dozens of gold diggers. Water got into the boat and soaked the supplies. Still, they made it, and by the end of September, they hit the main flow of the Yukon River, drifting north towards the gold fields. The river was wide and muddy, flowing slowly through endless wilderness. No settlements, no people, just bush, water, and sky. Days passed as they drifted along, only spotting other boats with blokes who looked just as knackered and determined as them. On the 9th of October, they reached Dawson City, a village at the mouth. Where the Yukon and Klondike meet, in less than 12 months, a messy jumble of tents and shacks had popped up out of nowhere. 20,000 people crammed into an area that could barely support 2,000. Mud covered the streets, the buildings were basic, and all the decent claims had already been snapped up. That harsh truth hit every newcomer who arrived too late. The first wave of gold seekers, the ones who'd rushed north the year before, had claimed all the worthwhile land. When Jack got there, you could buy claims that might have gold, but finding unpegged land with real prospects was nearly impossible. Jack and his mates staked 8 claims on the Stewart River, about 80 miles from Dawson. Those claims were legal and properly registered, but whether there was gold remained uncertain. Finding out meant digging. First, they needed shelter before they could dig through the frozen ground with hand tools in winter. They found a spot for a hut about 70 miles upstream on the Stewart River and started building. They stacked logs, filled the gaps with moss and clay, and hurried to beat the coming cold. Winter had properly kicked off by the time they'd finished their work. The thermometer dropped to -40, then kept going to -50. The Yukon River froze solid, leaving them totally stranded. Once their main route, the river had turned into a bloody ice wall you couldn't get through. No boats could move, and no supplies were getting through to them. They'd be completely cut off for 6 months, with only their own supplies to rely on. Jack decided to bring books, unlike the other blokes. The others brought extra mining gear or fancy stuff. In that freezing hut, Jack used his limited weight allowance for Darwin's On the Origin of Species and Milton's Paradise Lost. While the Arctic winter howled outside, he spent his time reading. The mining work was bloody brutal. To get down to bedrock, where there might be gold, they had to dig through permafrost. The ground was frozen solid down to 15 or 20 feet. They couldn't just dig, they had to thaw the ground first. They'd light a fire, let it burn for hours, scrape off the thawed bit, then start another fire. At best, they'd only get a few centimeters further each day. The work was physically draining, mate. Their hands got all cracked and bloody from the cold. Their backs seized up from hunching over the fires, and the smoke gave them coughing fits that left a metallic taste of blood in their mouths. And all that for what? To reach bedrock and see if their claim had any gold. Most didn't, and Jack's were no different. They dug, burnt, and scraped, only to find that none of it was worth the huge effort. But that wasn't the worst bit, mate. But the absolute worst was seeing what the Klondike did to the blokes' inner selves. In Dawson, blokes were getting into brawls over stuff they only thought was an insult. Even close mates who'd been thick as thieves turned hostile over suspicions of theft. Being stuck alone in the dark all the time sent plenty of blokes round the twist. The town was chock-a-block with gaming houses, dance joints, and ladies of the night. All that distraction helped him forget that most blokes left with less than they came with. Jack took note of everything. The cruelty was just as mental as it was physical. The Klondike peeled back the veneer of civility and showed what blokes turned into when all they cared about was staying alive. Then scurvy hit. No surprises there. No fresh veg in the Yukon winter, just salt pork, beans, and flour. None of them had any vitamin C. After months eating like that, gums got all puffy, teeth started wiggling, joints ached, and old injuries came back to life. Come early spring, Jack's gums were bleeding. He knew what that meant. Scurvy could kill you if it got too crooked. He'd seen blokes die from it. Their insides just fell apart. He had to get out, head back to civilization before the disease got too far gone. His mates agreed to stay and work the claims, while Jack planned to head downstream once the ice thawed. End of May, the Yukon ice broke up. It went off like cannons as big slabs shattered and tore downstream. Once the river was clear of ice, Jack and a few mates knocked together a raft and headed off. They floated 2,000 miles through some of the harshest country on the planet. No towns, no help if things went pear-shaped. Just the river and what they had on their backs. Jack's swollen gums gave him heaps of pain, so every feed was a real struggle. He was missing 4 front teeth, and his legs and hips were throbbing, while scurvy wrecked his connective tissue. But he was still kicking, and he came home with a treasure better than gold. True stories about real events that happened to real people. The raft trip went for weeks in a spot most blokes couldn't even picture. They went through river sections so remote that whole days went by without seeing a single person. They navigated rapids, dodged log jams, and stretched their shrinking supplies until they got to St. Michael, a trading post on the Bering Sea. When his cash was almost gone, Jack signed up on a ship to make sure he could get back to San Francisco. When he landed in California at the end of July 1898, he'd been gone nearly a whole year. He came back with even less cash than he'd had when he left. His health was stuffed, and his face had permanent scars from scurvy. At 22, he looked like he was 30. While he was away, his stepdad passed away, which pushed the family even further into debt. Jack needed a job straight away, but his crook health meant he couldn't do any physical work. With his swollen gums and sore joints, he couldn't go back to the tinned fish factory or the wharves. There was only one option left. Years before, after he won that writing comp, he decided to have a crack at being a writer. But saying you're a writer and actually making a living from it were two totally different stories. Jack didn't have a network, any formal education, or published stuff, except for that one comp entry from years back. But what he did have was a year of experiences that no other writer could match. He'd gone to the Klondike, seen humanity at its best and worst, and nearly kicked the bucket from cold, hunger, and sickness. He started writing every day. He gave himself a rock-solid goal of banging out 1,000 words each day, and he didn't budge, even when it was a real struggle. His yarns were all about the Yukon, the blokes he'd met, and the tough realities of living on the frontier. His early stories were shocking. Every mag he sent him to knocked him back. But Jack didn't chuck it in. He just kept plugging away, slow and steady. He got better, nailed the flow and structure of his stories, and worked out how to make readers really feel the chill and the dread. Back in December 1898, Overland Monthly said they'd run his story To the Man on Trial and offered him $5 for it. That $5 was the first cash he'd ever made from his writing. $5 for a yarn that took weeks of polishing, but it was a start. It meant that somewhere, someone reckoned his work was good enough to put in print. More acceptances rolled in, all from little mags offering modest amounts. 1,000 Deaths got snapped up by the Black Cap for $40, and Overland Monthly took on more of his Klondike tales. The cash wasn't near enough to live on, but it was solid proof that his mad plan might actually work. Jack was renting a room in Oakland, writing till his hands seized up, and scraping by on next to nothing. He had to look after his mom and stepsister, and keep himself fed, too. The pressure was relentless and bloody intense. But the only alternative was going back to hard yakka, and Jack had already made his call. He was dead set on making it as a writer, or dying in the attempt. By the middle of 1899, he'd had enough stories published that mags started coming to him. America's top literary mag, the Atlantic Monthly, took An Odyssey of the North and forked out $120 for it. Jack was gobsmacked. That was more than he'd made in months slogging at the cannery, and all for a yarn about the Klondike. The Klondike gave him his material and an edge. While other writers made stuff up or did research, Jack tapped into his own memories, what he'd been through, and the real truths he'd lived. He knew what it was like to dig through permafrost, the taste of scurvy, and the dead-on sound of ice cracking along the Yukon come spring. That realness came through in every line. Readers could feel it, and editors could pick it straight away. Die Person hier hat sich keine Geschichten ausgedacht. Das war einer, der wirklich dort war, das Ganze durchgemacht hat und Berichte von einem Ort geschickt hat, den die meisten nie zu sehen kriegen würden. Aber Jack war es nicht genug, nur kurze Artikel zu schreiben. Er brauchte ein größeres Werk, um zu zeigen, dass er mehr war als nur irgendein Zeitschriftenmitarbeiter. Was er brauchte, war ein Buch. Und so fing er im Sommer 1899 an, eins zu schreiben. In dem Buch ging's um den Hund. Mehr war da auch nicht geplant. Es war eine einfache Geschichte über ein Haustier, das aus Kalifornien geholt wurde und in der brutalen Umgebung vom Yukon als Schlittenhund arbeiten musste. Jack hatte anfangs keine großen Erwartungen an das Projekt. Er brauchte Kohle und wollte sich einen Ruf aufbauen, der über Zeitschriftenartikel hinausging. Ein Roman konnte beides. Er nannte es Der Ruf der Wildnis. Die Worte flossen schnell, schneller als bei allem, was er vorher geschrieben hatte. Die Geschichte kam ihm in nur wenigen Wochen, statt Monaten. Vielleicht lag's daran, dass er nicht zu viel drüber nachgedacht hat. Er hat einfach sein eigenes Wissen reingepackt. Die eisigen Temperaturen, die Härte. Die Geschichte zeigt, wie sich ein Wesen entwickelt, das gezwungen ist, Umstände durchzumachen, die alle Spuren von Zähmung abstreifen und eine wilde, instinktive Natur im Hund Buck freilegt. Buck wurde aus einem leichten Leben gerissen, zum Arbeiten verkauft, geschlagen, ausgehungert und angetrieben, bis seine Pfoten roh und blutig waren. Inmitten dieser Grausamkeit fand er eine verborgene Wahrheit. Eine Widerstandsfähigkeit, von der er nie wusste, dass er sie hat. Instinkte, die lange unter dem häuslichen Leben begraben waren, die Wildnis rief ihn, zu etwas Zeitlosem und Authentischem zurückzukehren. Jack hat das Manuskript Ende 1902 fertiggestellt, insgesamt 30.000 Wörter, und an Macmillan geschickt. Macmillan, einer der größten Verlage in Amerika, war total begeistert von dem Werk und wollte es sofort rausbringen. Aber es gab einen Haken. Sie haben $2.000 für den dauerhaften Besitz aller Rechte an dem Buch vorgeschlagen, keine zukünftigen Tantiemen. Einfach eine einmalige Zahlung von $2.000. Für Jack waren $2.000 ein kleines Vermögen, mehr Bargeld, als er je auf einmal gesehen hatte. But that also meant, no matter how many copies of the book were flogged, he wouldn't see a single extra cent from it. He had to think about negotiating for a better deal. Then he had a squiz around his rented place and pondered the growing stack of unpaid bills. With his family relying on him, The constant pressure to get results forced him to take the $2,000. In July 1903, The Call of the Wild hit the shelves. The book was a ripper success straight away. Critics loved it, and readers couldn't get enough of it. In the first few weeks, they flogged thousands of copies, and that number shot up to tens of thousands. It carved out a spot among the fastest-selling novels in American publishing history. Jack London's earnings from this work topped out at no more than $2,000. Without getting a single extra cent, he watched his masterpiece turn into a phenomenon while he was flat out trying to pay his rent. Macmillan made a mozza. Jack only copped his advance, a stuff-up that would dog him for the rest of his life. But it also taught him a bloody important lesson about being a writer. Always haggle hard, never sell yourself short, and never let go of your intellectual property rights. But the book did something money can never measure. It gave Jack London genuine fame, not just known in mags or lit circles, but properly famous. His name became well known right across the states. Readers were quoting his Yukon descriptions and chewing over Buck's transformation, hinting that it meant more than just a good yarn. And it bloody well did. The Call of the Wild was more than just a simple adventure yarn. It looked into what happens when you shake off civilization. When comfort and security vanish, you're forced to become what you were always meant to be, underneath all that social conditioning. The Klondike stripped Jack right back to his core, showed him what he was really made of, and that was something he'd already experienced in modern life. He poured that experience into Buck, back when survival was the only thing that mattered. Buck's journey mirrored his own, as the wilderness called out to the dog. That pull of the wild, the same one that first dragged Jack up to the Yukon, was the exact force calling to Buck. The audience saw it was genuine and realized this story wasn't made up. Far from some desk-made fiction, this tale passed on real truth through a dog's story. Success brought new dramas. Jack was in high demand. Magazines wanted more stories, publishers asked for extra books, and everyone wanted a piece of him. Since he was always short on cash, he gave them what they wanted. In 1904, he wrote The Sea Wolf, which was an instant hit, featuring a ruthless skipper. That novel sold even better than The Call of the Wild, focusing on the blokes stuck under the captain's authority. This time, Jack scored a better deal with royalties and a cut of sales, but at the same time, he had a more worrying experience. His writing speed directly boosted his income, and his rising expenses matched that growth. As costs went up, so did the need to write faster, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that sped up with every success. He bought a house in Oakland. It wasn't a mansion, but a decent property, a proper family home. Then he bought more land, and then even more. He invested in profitable ventures, helped mates in need, and donated to socialist movements he believed in. His spending matched his earnings, forcing him to keep writing without a break, interruption, or slowdown. Churning out 1,000 words a day became an absolute must. Failing to write meant he couldn't cover the costs, which led to total collapse, even though his personal life was already falling apart. Back in 1900, before all the success and fame, he married Bessie Madden. She was all about practicality and common sense, managed the money well, exactly the sort of reliable partner an up-and-coming writer needed. Jack and his missus had 2 girls, Joan and Bess. He loved them, but their relationship was dodgy from the start. Bessie wanted the traditional life, a husband who came home at decent hours, and a household that did all the usual family stuff. Jack craved excitement, freedom, and experiences that'd feed his writing. As his fame grew, he found the limits of home life more and more of a pain. In 1903, he met Charmian Kittredge, a woman 5 years older than him, well-educated and keen for adventure. She rode horses, sailed boats, and didn't have much time for traditional social rules. She got into philosophy and political chats, and she totally got what Jack was trying to do with his writing. Unlike how he felt about Bessie, Jack fell head over heels for Charmian, started an affair, tried to hide it, and ended up spectacularly failing. The scandal blew up in 1904, much to the newspaper's delight. Famous author leaves wife and kids for an older lover. Before, socialists had welcomed Jack as one of their own. Now they turned on him. How could he push for workers' rights and social justice while ditching his own family? Jack couldn't care less. He was over the hypocrisy and a suffocating marriage, so he left and started divorce proceedings. The whole situation was messy, public, and bad for his reputation, costing him mates. It also lost him the support of political allies who'd backed him before. But he still married Charmian. In November 1905, just a day after the divorce was finalized, she became his partner in all aspects of life. The one who understood that his urge to write wasn't just a job, but an all-consuming obsession. They tried to start a family. Charmian got pregnant, and they made heaps of plans. She had a miscarriage, so they gave it another crack. But that pregnancy ended in loss, too. This time around, a daughter passed away just after she was born. The grief was just bloody overwhelming. Writing became his escape from everything, the heartache, the money troubles, and all that constant criticism that was on his tail. He could just lose himself in stories and shape the narrative in ways he couldn't manage in real life. He wrote White Fang as the sequel to The Call of the Wild, a trip in reverse, a wolf dog making the move from the wild into civilization. Even though it was a success, Jack realized he was just recycling old ideas and sticking to the same tired formulas, instead of trying something new. The trouble was that both the publishers and the readers wanted the same old stuff. More Yukon tales, more dogs and wolves, more gritty survival yarns. Every time Jack tried something new, sales would take a dive. But when he stuck to what he knew, they went up. So he made a compromise. He gave the punters what they wanted, while quietly slipping in his own messages on the side. Published in 1908, The Iron Heel painted a picture of a dystopian world where a fascist oligarchy was trampling on workers' rights. That was hands down his most political piece. He tried to use fiction as a tool for social change, but the critics hated it, saying it was just propaganda, too preachy and heavy-handed. Sales were a bit disappointing, to say the least. Jack didn't really care. He'd said what he needed to say and used his platform for something bigger than just entertainment. Still, the setbacks stung and reminded him that his influence only went so far. Most readers didn't want politics in their escape stories. They were after a bit of a distraction, not a lesson on economic inequality, so he just kept on writing, churning out stories, novels, articles, and journalistic bits. From 1899 to 1910, his creative output never let up. Jack London knocked out over 20 books, plus hundreds of short stories and articles. This crazy pace just couldn't be kept up. His health started to go downhill. The scurvy he picked up in the Klondike did lasting damage. He copped it with bad teeth and ongoing joint pain. Kidney issues cropped up. Might have been from the extreme physical grind of his early years, plus the mental pressure of non-stop deadline. His doctors told him to take it easy. They said he should rest and write less, but he didn't listen. Slowing down would mean less dough, and less dough would mean giving up the life he'd built. All that property, the land, his ability to look after not just himself and Charmian, but also his mum, his daughters, mates, and various causes outside of writing. If you stripped away his identity, what'd be left? A former oyster pirate with just a year 8 education. A former adventurer living off past glories. Writing gave him a sense of worth, proved he was more than where he came from, more than the poverty he escaped, so he drove himself even harder. He'd slam extra coffee to stay awake and whiskey to wind down, whatever it took to keep the momentum going. The daily 1,000-word target went from being a discipline to a shackle. Some days the words came easy. Most days they didn't. Still, he forced him out, because giving up just wasn't an option. In 1907, Jack and Charmian decided to sail around the world. They ordered the building of a boat called the Snark, named after Lewis Carroll's quirky creature. Their plan was to travel the world for 7 years, document everything, and live the life Jack had always dreamt of. Right from the start, the Snark was a complete dud. The boat was shoddily built, had heaps of leaks, and cost twice what they'd budgeted. But they went ahead anyway. First to Hawaii, then the Marquesas, Tahiti, and Samoa. That trip ticked all of Jack's boxes. He saw new places and had new experiences that gave him heaps of story ideas. But his health went downhill. The tropical weather made things worse. He picked up skin infections and gut troubles he didn't even know about. Problems were piling up, heaps of them. But he tried to ignore them, just kept sailing, writing, and staying active. Then when they finally got to Australia, by 1908, Jack's health was really crook. After seeing a doc, they found heaps of issues and told him to get straight back to California for treatment. The trip that was meant to last 7 years ended in under 2. They flogged the Snark and headed back home. At only 28, Jack's body was going downhill fast. All that physical slog from his teenage years up in the Klondike, the non-stop pressure of deadlines and managing money, plus his drinking, it all caught up with him. It all hit him at once, but he couldn't bring himself to slow down. The costs kept mounting, and his obligations got heavier. He'd bought more land in the Sonoma Valley, aiming to set up a proper working ranch. On that land, he wanted to use scientific farming methods to prove that modern techniques could make farming pay. Sustainable farming became another obsession, a project that drained both his cash and the energy he didn't have. But Jack wanted more than just writing, something real, something lasting that'd outlive him. That ranch became his new purpose in life, even more important than his writing or his fame. He meant to shake up farming in California and show that smarts and careful planning could beat old traditions and crazy beliefs, making something that'd last. He threw himself into this project with the same passion he gave to everything he did. He kept buying up more land, bringing in specialized livestock, putting up barns and irrigation, hiring blokes, reading farm magazines, cooking up strategies, and never stopping his writing. The ranch was always after cash. Everything needed money. and churning out more articles was the only way to bring it in. The property went from 130 acres to 400, then 800, then 1,400, and Jack kept snapping up the blocks next door. He just couldn't help himself. Every piece of land meant potential. Another paddock to work, another slope to terrace, another acre to turn rubbish dirt into good cropping country. He called it Beauty Ranch. The name showed what he was aiming for. Most of the land was stuffed. Years of dodgy farming had sucked the life out of the soil, and erosion had carved great gullies down the hills. The owners before him had taken all they could and never gave anything back. Jack saw chances where others just saw rubbish, and he reckoned scientific farming could fix the land up. Modern methods meant rotation cropping, terracing to stop erosion, and bringing in stock with better breeding. He'd read everything: farm mags, science papers, government reports, and he wanted to show that brains and forward thinking could make farming pay. He knew the irony all too well. The socialist who'd bagged capitalism was now turning into a big landholder himself. Still, he had his excuse. Yeah, it was exploitation, but he paid his workers well, more than most ranch owners did. He was building things up, creating instead of wrecking. And anyway, someone had to show there was a different way to do it. The ranch was gobbling up cash faster than his writing could earn it. Gum trees to stop erosion, a flash concrete silo, purebred stock from all over, machines, sheds, systems. Every upgrade needed a stack of cash. Jack just kept on investing, planning, expanding. Back in 1911, he started planning a house. Not just any house, but a mansion that'd last 1,000 years. Built from stone and redwood, it had 4 stories and 26 rooms, knocked together to survive quakes, fire, and the ages. He brought in Albert Farr, a top architect from San Fran, and didn't skimp on materials or workmanship. Wolf House, that's what it was called. His monument, his permanent mark on the property. The property was going to stick around long after he was gone, a real testament that Jack London was here and made his mark. He built something more solid than just words on a page, which could get overlooked or lost over time. Building the place took 2 years, and the costs blew way out past the original budget. Jack didn't sweat it. He borrowed more, put the ranch up as security, and kept writing to pay for it all. That was his legacy. This structure was meant to stand tall, even after he'd kicked the bucket. By August 1913, Wolf House was just about done, just a few finishing touches left. After years living in a little cottage on the land, Jack and Charmian were all set to move into the house, the dream home Jack had always pictured. Their dream was just about to become a reality. On the night of the 22nd of August, Jack got woken by screams. He looked out the window and saw flames. Wolf House was going up in flames. He ran over and tried to get in, but the heat was so bloody intense he had to back off. Helpless, he just watched the fire devour the lot. The redwood timber and stone, 2 years of hard yakka. All the cash, every plan, all gone. By dawn, there was nothing left but rubble. The walls were still up, but gutted. The roof had caved in, and the inside was just wreckage. The structure meant to stand for 1,000 years didn't even make it through one night. The investigators thought it was arson. Possible suspects included unhappy workers, socialists who reckoned Jack was a traitor, business competitors, and blokes he'd pissed off with his writing. The investigation didn't turn up a clear answer. No one was charged, and they never officially figured out what caused it. Jack tried to stay cool, telling everyone he'd rebuild the house. He even sketched out new plans for Wolf House, but something inside him snapped that night. The money loss was brutal. 50 grand or maybe 75 grand gone. Even worse was the emotional toll. His whole vision was completely wrecked. His legacy got stuffed before it even had a chance to get off the ground. And because he was strapped for cash, he never got to rebuild it. He still had to sort out the debt from the original house. And deep down, he'd already chucked the whole idea in. If the Wolf House could go up in flames before he even stepped inside, then what was the bloody point? Everything was just temporary. Nothing ever lasted. It was smarter to put his energy into assets that brought in the dough instead of eating it all up. The ranch stuck around. He kept on writing, but that fire was a real game changer. After the Wolf House got destroyed, Jack's health went downhill fast because of the stress and money worries. The hard truth was that his big dreams kept falling apart, and his kidneys were packing it in too. The fallout from years of heavy drinking was finally showing. The sicknesses he picked up on the snark trip were still causing him grief. He had gut issues that the doctors couldn't seem to get a proper diagnosis on. The troubles were non-stop by then. He started using morphine and opium to take the edge off the pain, stuff that was legal and you could get without a script, and doctors were happy to recommend it. Jack told himself he was just being practical by managing his symptoms so he could keep on working, because the other option was being stuck and useless. At first, the meds were a big help. They dulled the pain enough for him to stay at his desk and bash out his 1,000 words a day. He was still bringing in a steady income, But his body got used to it pretty fast and needed bigger doses for the same kick. And then, even bigger ones. The line between managing pain and being hooked got blurry, and then it just vanished altogether. By 1914, you could see Jack was falling apart. Even though he was only 38, he looked way older. His once solid frame had gone all soft, and his good-looking face was now puffy and wrecked by burst blood vessels. His teeth were yellow from all the tobacco, even though the doctors had told him he had throat cancer. In 1914, he kept taking on jobs as a war correspondent in Mexico. Couldn't stop even if he wanted to. Chasing down the revolution, he was driven by the same restless energy that had taken him aboard the Snark earlier. He was chasing stories and adventures, all while running away from the truth about his declining health. The tough conditions in Mexico, extreme heat, diseases everywhere, constant danger, were just too much for Jack's health. He came back in worse shape than when he left, but he'd got his stories sorted. Most importantly, he'd sent his reports to the papers and pocketed his fee. The quality of his writing started slipping, something he, critics, and more readers were noticing. The spark that had fired up his early writing was slowly dying out. Books were churned out one after another, leading to stories that felt reused, bringing back old characters and mirroring plots from earlier works. But slowing down wasn't an option. The ranch needed cash, Charmian needed his backing, his mom and daughters needed help, and heaps of causes and mates were relying on him. The creative engine had to keep running, so he kept writing, even though it hurt, and it was a struggle to get words on the page. Even though he knew his output wasn't up to his best, Hawaii became a sanctuary. On Charmian's urging, he spent time there in 1915 and 1916, enjoying a milder climate than California's. At a more relaxed pace, Jack could rest, recover, and maybe knock out some quality writing again, free from constant demands. He gave it a crack and wrote a few stories, but even Hawaii couldn't fix his deep-seated problems. His physical condition got worse, especially his kidneys, which were damaged as uremia set in. Toxins built up in his bloodstream because his organs couldn't filter him out properly. Taking morphine and opium made things worse. His kidneys couldn't metabolize the drugs, which led to even more toxicity. But stopping them meant copping unbearable pain. He was stuck in a right bind. He needed the meds to get by, but they were destroying the very organs that had to process them. Docs told him to knock off the booze, change up his meals, get more exercise, and take it easy. But he knocked back nearly all of it. He couldn't rest or ditch his old habits. When he had clear moments, the money pressure was crushing. The responsibilities were way too much, and the fear of failing was bloody enormous. Jack knew his time was coming, not straight away, but soon enough. The writing was on the wall. His body couldn't keep up this pace for much longer. But what other choice did he have? Stop writing and chuck it all in? Go bankrupt? Admit he'd been beaten? Through sheer grit and skill, he dragged himself out of poverty and turned himself into someone important. A bloke whose name carried weight, who traveled the world and had adventures that most people only ever heard about in stories. He couldn't go back to being a nobody, couldn't let it all fall apart. So he pushed on, writing through the pain, drinking to numb it, taking meds to make it bearable, ignoring the warning signs his body kept sending. He told himself he just had to finish this next novel, make this upcoming payment, hit that deadline, then he'd kick back and relax. Even as his health went downhill, the projects on the ranch kept going, and Jack kept coming up with improvements. New crops to try, different animal breeds, better irrigation systems. He couldn't stop planning, couldn't give up on building a lasting legacy. He was haunted by Martin Eden, that 1909 book he'd written about a writer who found success but discovered it was all empty. A character who realizes fame and fortune don't fill the void, and gets so disillusioned he tops himself. Jack had written that novel as a bit of a self-portrait, a warning to himself about the dangers of success. Now in 1916, lying in his bed as the pain spread through his whole body, his kidneys failing, morphine barely taking the edge off, he saw Martin Eden from a new angle, not just as a warning, but as a prophecy. The triumph he'd chased so hard had destroyed him just as surely as poverty would have. Different method, same result. Sometimes he'd think back to the Klondike, that time in the frozen north when he was 21 and fit as a fiddle. The whole universe seemed full of possibilities back then, reading Darwin and Milton by candlelight in a little log hut. And he was dead certain that understanding the world was the way to master it. Back then he was so sure, so bloody confident. Intelligenz und Entschlossenheit konnten jede Hürde nehmen und einem armen Kind aus Oakland ermöglichen, alles zu werden, was es sein wollte. Und das ist es auch geworden. Er hatte es geschafft. Er wurde berühmt, reich und richtig Jack London. Aber anscheinend hat ihn das seine Gesundheit gekostet. Im Klondike verlor er seine Zähne durch Skorbut und Tropenkrankheiten sowie Drogenkonsum ruinierten seine Nieren. Jahrelanges schweres Trinken hatte seine Leber angegriffen und ständiges Rauchen führte zu Kehlkopfkrebs.
Das Gleiche galt für seine Beziehungen.
Seine erste Ehe ging in die Brüche, weil er seinen Ehrgeiz über die Familie stellte. Seine zweite Ehe war angespannt wegen seiner Besessenheiten, seiner schwindenden Gesundheit und seiner Unfähigkeit, im Jetzt zu leben, statt ständig das nächste Ziel zu verfolgen. Dann war da noch sein Schreiben. Genau das, was ihn gerettet hatte. Was ihn einst aus der Armut holte und seinem Leben Sinn gab, wurde zu einem Gefängnis, einem Job, aus dem er nicht rauskam. Es war eine Last, die ihn bedrückte statt befreite. Die Ironie traf ihn hart. Er war zum Arbeitssklaven geworden, genau wie die Fabrikarbeiter, über die er schrieb, ein anderer Kragen, aber dieselben Fesseln. Er tauschte seine Gesundheit, Zeit und Fähigkeiten gegen Geld, das er sofort für Projekte ausgab, die noch mehr Geld verschlangen. Es war eine Endlosschleife ohne Ausweg, und am 21. November 1916 erreichte sie ihren Höhepunkt. Jacks Schmerzen waren an dem Tag schlimmer als sonst. Er nahm mehr Morphin, als sein Rezept erlaubte, um einschlafen zu können. Charmian machte sich Sorgen, griff aber nicht ein. Was hätte sie tun sollen? Ihn zwingen, die Schmerzen zu ertragen? In dieser Nacht zog er sich auf die Schlafveranda ihres Häuschens zurück, nicht ins Wulfhaus. Diese großartige Vision war in Flammen aufgegangen. Übrig blieb nur das bescheidene Häuschen, das sie bewohnten, während sie auf eine Villa warteten, die nie Realität wurde. Am nächsten Morgen, dem 22. November, fand Charmian ihn bewusstlos und rief die Ärzte. Die kamen sofort und taten alles Mögliche. Jack's kidneys ended up completely packing it in. The buildup of uric poisoning, all those toxins his body couldn't get rid of, reached deadly levels. He passed away that same day, never waking up again. At 40, he was one of the most famous authors in the world, but flat broke. Even though he'd been earning his whole life, that fortune was meant to look after his family for years to come. Even though the official cause of death was listed as uric poisoning, the real story was a lot more complicated. It was the result of years of non-stop slogging, hard yakka, heavy drinking, and always ignoring his own well-being. He stubbornly refused to take it easy, slow down, or admit that he wasn't actually bulletproof. Among his loved ones, there was some whispers about suicide. The morphine overdose, the timing, and his recent chats about death raised eyebrows. But nothing suggests he planned to kick the bucket that night. It's more likely he was just trying to manage pain that had gotten out of hand. His already knackered body couldn't cop the extra load. His remains were cremated. His ashes were scattered on the ranch he loved so much. He blew all his savings sprucing up the beautiful ranch, which had soaked up heaps of money, effort, and optimism. The land he wanted to turn into a lasting legacy. And Charmian stayed on there. She kept the ranch going as best she could, got Jack's unpublished works out there, and looked after his posthumous fame. She'd been his mate through everything. The adventures, the writing, the dream. Now she took on the role of guardian of his legacy, while his books kept on trucking. That was the legacy that really stuck around. Titles like The Call of the Wild, White Fang, The Sea Wolf, Martin Eden, and heaps more kept selling, kept being read, and kept grabbing new generations of readers. The remains of Wolf House are still standing and pulling in tourists who wander through the skeleton of Jack's vision, checking out the massive stone walls that held up against the fire. Imagine what it would have looked like if the building had been finished. But maybe the ruins are more fitting, more honest, a nod to efforts that never quite made it, to visions that turned out to be impossible to keep, a symbol of the gap between what we dream and what we actually achieve. Jack London's legacy has a few layers to it. He wrote stories that hook millions of readers back then, and still do today. The Call of the Wild has been in print non-stop. While White Fang is often part of the curriculum, The Sea Wolf is seen as a timeless piece of nautical lit. But the bloke who created these enduring works was also, he had serious flaws, held racist views that were extreme even for his day. His belief in white superiority was as passionate as his commitment to everything else. And his writings include passages that make modern audiences deeply uncomfortable. The Asian characters in his stories are just stereotypes, caricatures born from prejudice rather than real observation. His beliefs about racial hierarchy weren't just the common view of his time. They were outright opinions he kept pushing. London saw the Yellow Peril as a real threat, and genuinely believed Asian immigrants were a danger to white society. He talked about it in articles, gave speeches on the topic, and wove it into several of his fiction works. It was anything but subtle. This was a blatant ideology woven into his adventure tales and political writings. How do we make sense of that contradiction? The gifted storyteller who described Buck's journey in the Yukon, and at the same time, the author of hateful, racist writings. When it comes to Asian immigrants, there's no simple answer. You can appreciate the work while condemning the beliefs of the creator. Accept that people are full of contradictions, have many sides, and some of those sides are uncomfortable.
Londons sozialistische Überzeugungen waren ebenfalls nicht ohne Schwierigkeiten.
Er kämpfte für die Rechte der Arbeiter, meinte aber, dass diese hauptsächlich weißen Arbeitern zustehen sollten. Er sah den Klassenkampf, deutete ihn jedoch durch eine rassistische Brille, die das Gesamtbild verzerrt. In The People of the Abyss zeigte er echte Anteilnahme für die Armen in London. Seine Schilderungen aus den Armenvierteln waren mitfühlend, genau und voller Wut auf die Systeme, die dieses Leid verursachten. Aber diese Empathie galt nicht für alle gleichermaßen. Sein Fürsorge hatte Grenzen, die durch Rassenunterschiede gezogen wurden, die er für angeboren und entscheidend hielt. Dieser Widerspruch zieht sich durch sein ganzes Werk. Geschichten, die die Missachtung der Natur für soziale Hierarchien feiern, stehen neben Texten, die die Überlegenheit weißer Menschen behaupten. Romane, die den Sozialdarwinismus in Frage stellen, finden sich direkt neben Sachbüchern, die ihn unterstützen. Die Ranch wurde zu einer besonderen Form des Vermächtnisses. Nach Jacks Tod blieb Charmian und kümmerte sich um das Anwesen. Sie setzte seine landwirtschaftlichen Experimente fort, mit weniger Luxus, aber besserem ökologischem Gleichgewicht. Sie lebte dort bis 1955, fast 4 Jahrzehnte nach Jacks Tod. Die Beauty Ranch wurde zu ihrem Lebenswerk. Sein Erbe zu bewahren, seine literarischen Werke zu verwalten und den Traum auf angepasste Weise am Leben zu erhalten. Schon damals zogen die Überreste des Wolf House Besucher an. Die Touristen waren fasziniert von der verkohlten Villa, den beständigen Steinmauern um die riesigen Kamine herum, die dort standen, wo die große Halle geplant war. Heute wird es als State Park betrieben, bekannt als Jack London State Historic Park. Besucher können das Gelände durchstreifen, das Cottage besichtigen, in dem er starb, die Ruinen erkunden und an der Stelle stehen, wo das prächtige Haus fast gebaut worden wäre. Seine Grabstätte befindet sich ebenfalls dort, ein bescheidenes Denkmal in der Nähe des Ortes, an dem seine Asche verstreut wurde. Es gibt kein großes Denkmal, nur einen Felsen mit einer Gedenktafel, die Art von natürlicher Ehrung, die er wahrscheinlich allem Prunkvollen vorgezogen hätte. Even after he kicked the bucket, his books kept selling, and they're still popular today. Just The Call of the Wild alone has sold millions of copies, been printed in heaps of languages, and made into films more than once. That story's got a thing that clicks with people from all sorts of cultures and times. Buck's change from a spoilt pet into a wild creature is like him going back to his original roots. Finding inner strength by getting through hard times speaks to us because it's a basic kind of archetype. Later on, Joseph Campbell would lay out the hero's journey structure: separation, initiation, and return. Without even realizing it, London put mythic structures into his yarns. White Fang works the same way, but in the opposite direction. The path from wild to tame, from just surviving to trust in, from aggression to affection, uses the same archetypal power, just flipped around. These stories go beyond what their author could personally achieve, and they hit on a universal theme of change, adapting, and finding your place. Martin Eden stands out. It's more personal, more painful. It tells the story of a writer's journey from poverty to riches and disappointment, making it London's most autobiographical work. In his darkest novel, Eden gets everything he dreams of: fame, wealth, recognition, only to realize it's all meaningless. Success leaves him feeling empty inside. The literary establishment he worked so hard to get into seems shallow and crooked, so he takes his own life. He climbs off a ship into the sea, choosing death over putting up with a world that's lost all meaning. London wrote this in 1909, 7 years before he died himself, and he was already feeling the emptiness that fame had brought. That realization, that achieving your dreams doesn't guarantee happiness. For decades, boffins have debated how much Martin Eden reflects London's own life. They've also argued how much of his own despair London saw in Eden, and whether the novel was a warning or a prophecy. Regardless, it remains his most complex psychological work. This yarn's about a fella who's undone by getting exactly what he wanted. He can't cop any meaning from his successes. The Seawolf's just as bleak, but for different reasons. Wolf Larsen's the standout baddie in London's work, a Nietzschean Superman who's all about power and sheer determination. He's got no moral code apart from power, no emotions except what suits him. What's truly scary is his intelligence and eloquence. He can lay out his worldview dead set eloquently and justify it. He's not some simple brute, but a thinking monster. London writes him in such a gripping way. That's what makes it so bloody unsettling. Larsen's arguments come across with so much force that readers can feel their pull, the temptation of that might makes right mindset. The book doesn't support Larsen's beliefs. The main bloke, Humphrey Van Weyden, knocks him back. But London gave Larsen the best dialogue, the most impressive presence. He's the character that overshadows the whole show. You get this feeling of fascination as London explores ideas that he was drawn to, even while he tries to take him on. That same conflict runs through all his writing. His short stories show different angles on this theme. His most famous short yarn is To Build a Fire. A lone bloke in bloody freezing conditions makes a few small mistakes and cops it. The story's starkness is ruthless. Nature couldn't give a toss whether you live or die. The universe is dead set apathetic. Being clever or resourceful means jack all if you misjudge the cold or your fire gives out. The story works because London knew that cold firsthand. He lived it in the Klondike and got its deadly nature completely. The exact details come from his own real-life experiences. Love of Life follows a similar pattern. A wounded, abandoned bloke drags himself through the bush, hanging on to survival, his will to live stripped right back. Stories like these peel back the layers of civilized society. Show people as critters in the battle for survival, stripped of ideas, politics, or social structures. Just the raw fight for staying alive. Jack London was a bloody master at showing these basic fights. Humans against the wild, against fierce beasts, and against their own personal boundaries. His adventure yarn set the stage for what we call survival lit today, a genre all about tough conditions and life-or-death struggles. He really set the bar for this kind of writing. His nonfiction book, The People of the Abyss, ain't as famous, but it's just as important. It helped kick off social reform movements. His coverage of the Russo-Japanese War got a massive readership. The book John Barleycorn had a big impact on early chats about alcohol addiction. He was a journo and a novelist in equal measure, covering places and situations most writers steered clear of, using his own adventures for his fiction and nonfiction. In his work, the line between the two forms was often pretty blurry. He turned real happenings into stories and used storytelling tricks in his nonfiction, so the boundaries got real fluid. Today's academics reckon he's a cultural icon that captures the contradictions of his era. Progressive politics mixed with backward racist views, celebrating individualism while backing socialist collective efforts, and loving nature but also pushing social Darwinism. He was the living embodiment of the conflicting forces shaping America back at the turn of the century. The country was industrializing fast, cities were growing, and immigration was shaking up the population's makeup. As old certainties faded away, London tried to make sense of these changes in his writing, sometimes with deep insights, but also showing his own biases and limits. There's no argument about his influence on later writers. Hemingway picked up London's tight style, Kerouac his love for travel, and Steinbeck his sympathy for the working class. The kind of adventure story he helped start spawned heaps of followers. Tales of surviving the wilderness, humans fighting nature, and personal change through tough times. His failures teach us stuff too. The ranch that sent him broke, the wolf house he never finished, his marriage that fell apart, and his health going downhill. These weren't just personal bad luck. They came from living way too intense, with a drive that never let up, and a refusal to accept any boundaries. Jack London's journey has a real fair dinkum American quality. He was dead set that pure determination could beat any hurdle, that success just needed enough effort, and that you could completely change who you are. He showed it could be done. A kid from poverty became a celebrated writer, but he also showed that wasn't enough. Achievement doesn't automatically give you satisfaction or peace. The beauty ranch still runs, but not like London pictured it. There's no big farming experiment, just a working farm and a historic landmark, humble, eco-friendly, and more down-to-earth than his dreams. The ruins of Wolf House stay unrepaired, kept as they are, walls open to the sky. Stone fireplaces lead nowhere, a tribute to ambition that went beyond what was possible. Maybe that's the most honest monument. Not the grand mansion he imagined, but the proof of its collapse, the gap between dream and reality, made permanent. His books are on shelves around the world, on school syllabuses, adapted into films, and studied in academic papers. The writing outlived the author by over 100 years and keeps going, and that's the legacy that really lasts. Not the estate, not the house, not the political views. The stories, the characters, the writing that still grabs audiences and pulls them into worlds of frost, wild nature, and endurance. The Call of the Wild still attracts new readers because the story still works, and Buck's transformation still strikes a chord. That shift from society to the wild touches something deep in human nature. We're all tamed creatures who remember being wild, or at least reckon we do, and dream of shedding culture and going back to a purer state. London put that daydream into words with passion, made it real, and created a narrative that audiences could dive into. At their peak, writers do this. They shape emotions and ideas that start as vague urges and make them so precise that others can experience them. Jack London achieved that despite his flaws, contradictions, and controversial views. He created stories that last, characters that breathe, writing that still has power. The bloke died at 40, but the work stayed. That's the irony. Even though the body might fade, the words stick around. And those words kept selling through the 1920s, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, with each generation finding their own interpretations. Readers looking for action wanted thrills. Socialists embraced him as a mate, and nature lovers appreciated the lively portrayals of the wilderness. There was something for everyone, which partly explains its lasting appeal. The books worked on multiple levels. You could see The Call of the Wild as a simple adventure yarn, a dog surviving in the wild. Or you could read it as an allegory, a clash between civilization and nature, a search for true identity, or a meditation on evolution and survival. London probably meant all these interpretations. He was sharp, understood his audience and the market, but also genuinely believed in his writing. That contradiction didn't bother him at all. In his view, art and commerce weren't separate concepts. Good stories deserved to be sold. Being popular didn't mean being shallow. He proved that truth over and over. We can't ignore the racism in his work. It shows up explicitly in some stories and as underlying assumptions of Anglo-Saxon superiority throughout. Applying social Darwinism to human races was typical of his time, but that doesn't justify it. Modern readers rightly criticize this. As a result, some of his writings have aged. The racial ideologies he adopted and spread were wrong. These ideas were harmful and went against his own socialist principles. You can't advocate for working-class unity while pushing racial hierarchies. Even back then, this inconsistency was blatant. Critics pointed it out, but London never addressed it. His typical response was to dig in, justify his views, and refer to pseudoscientific works. He was wrong and stubborn in his error. This poses a challenge to his reputation. Should we reject his whole body of work just because some bits are racist? Should we just reckon he's a relic of his time, a product of his era? Or should we try to hang on to the good bits while copping to the bad? There's no easy answer, mate. Different readers take different tacks. Reckon it's dodgy to pretend the racism ain't there, because it's baked right into his worldview. His writing's content and style got shaped by that. Booze was always a recurring theme too. In his boozy memoir, John Barleycorn, he's dead set open about how the grog messed with his life. He started sinking piss when he was a young bloke. Grog was dead important in the culture of wharfies, adventurers, and writers. Knocking back booze for years wrecked his health and stuffed his kidneys. But he made it sound cool too, like part of being a tough writer who could outdrink anyone. That was all an act, just like every other bit of his public persona. The book's a weird one. It blends a yarn about his life with a sobriety leaflet. He's telling us not to drink, but he still shows the good side, the comfort, the mateship, how it lets you loosen up and makes life feel bigger and brighter. Then he spills on the cost, forgetting stuff, wasted time, and your body packing it in. The book came out in 1913, just 3 years before he kicked the bucket. By then, he already knew the grog was doing him in. But he never stopped, either couldn't or just wouldn't. Doesn't really matter which one it was. Charmian stuck with him through thick and thin. His boozing, his health dramas, money troubles, and wrecked dreams. She sailed with him on the Snark, looked after him when he was crook, and worked as his secretary and manager. After he passed, she looked after his literary estate, managed his affairs, kept his memory alive, and put out 2 books about his life. Durch das Hervorheben seiner abenteuerlichen und lebhaften Seite und das Herunterspielen der dunkleren Dinge hat sie die öffentliche Erinnerung an ihn geprägt. Ein cleverer Schachzug. Sie wollte das Andenken ihres Mannes bewahren, aber das führte zu einer geschönten Version. Das übliche Bild von Jack London als Abenteurer, Naturforscher und Sozialist ignorierte seinen Alkoholismus, Rassismus und seine persönlichen Grausamkeiten. Spätere Lebensbeschreiber bekamen Zugang zu mehr Material wie Briefen, unveröffentlichten Manuskripten und Unterlagen zu seinen Finanzen. Sie malten ein umfassenderes, nuancierteres Bild, das nicht mehr so eindeutig heldenhaft war. Die Persönlichkeit, die sich zeigte, war gleichzeitig brillant und fehlerbehaftet, visionär und doch blind, großzügig, aber auch egoistisch. All diese Charakterzüge waren gleichermaßen echt. Das ist ganz normal menschlich. Aber wir wollen lieber, dass unsere kulturellen Idole einfach gestrickt sind. Entweder Heilige oder Bösewichte. London passt nicht in so eine einfache Schublade. Er hat Großes geleistet, aber auch Schaden angerichtet. Beides ist wahr. Man kann seinen Einfluss, vor allem auf die amerikanische Literatur, kaum überschätzen. Er hat gezeigt, dass man über Arbeiter, die Natur und Abenteuer schreiben, und trotzdem als ernstzunehmender Schriftsteller gelten kann. Literaturkritiker haben ihn vielleicht abgeschrieben, aber die Leser haben seine Bücher verschlungen. Und andere Autoren haben aufgepasst. Hemingways prägnanter Stil hat Londons direkter Art einiges zu verdanken. Steinbecks Mitgefühl für Arbeiter spiegelt Londons sozialistische Überzeugungen und die größere Tradition der amerikanischen Abenteuerliteratur wider. Viele sehen in ihm den Ursprung. Manche Werke sind bewundernswert, andere abgeleitet, aber er hat dieses Gebiet eröffnet. Vor allem seine Texte zur Natur wirken erstaunlich aktuell. Seine Schilderungen der Wildnis, sein Fokus auf tierisches Verhalten und seine Sichtweise, dass die Natur ihren eigenen Gesetzen folgt, ohne sich um menschliche Belange zu kümmern. Das war keine gefühlvolle Naturliteratur. Da gab es keinen pathetischen Fehlschluss, keine Zuschreibung menschlicher Emotionen an die Landschaft. Die Wildnis in Londons Werken ist atemberaubend und tödlich zugleich. Sie ist dir gegenüber gleichgültig, und um zu überleben, musst du diesen Respekt haben. Diese Perspektive beeinflusste spätere Naturschriftsteller wie Edward Abbey, Barry Lopez und Annie Dillard, die alle London gelesen und seinen unsentimentalen Stil übernommen haben. The road that socialist texts went down was a bit different. Early on, they had heaps of influence and were read widely in the labor movements. But his specific version of socialism was pretty unique. It blended social Darwinism, individualism, and racist notions, while socialist movements were moving towards more sophisticated analyses. By the middle of the century, London's work came across as rough and inconsistent. It was pretty much ignored and only stuck in people's minds as a historical oddity. His fiction survived, but his political writings didn't, except as examples of early American socialism that researchers look into but don't really take on board. His sci-fi gives us a ripper example. Before Adam gives a picture of early humans. The Scarlet Plague shows California after the Big One, and The Iron Heel paints a future dystopia. These stories weren't fully fleshed out as sci-fi. They were more like idea experiments, but they did show what the genre could do and had an impact on later authors. Over in England, H.G. Wells was onto similar ideas, and London was the American equivalent. Even though he wasn't as flash at spinning long yarns, he was asking the same sorts of questions. If civilization went down the gurgler, what bits of human nature would stick around? And how would Bloke survive? Some of his best stuff is in his short stories. To Build a Fire is a cracker of narrative efficiency. Bloke versus the elements. Every word counts. Pure storytelling drive. Love of Life shows the same sort of talent in showing survival when things look dead set hopeless. These stories work a treat because London knew the landscape like the back of his hand, had been through the hard yards himself, and could really bring across the cold, hunger, exhaustion, fear, and the physical truth of surviving. His novels are all over the shop quality-wise. Some are absolute rippers, like Call of the Wild, White Fang, and The Sea Wolf, while others are pretty ordinary. Rushed off his feet, too much plot, not enough depth. He knew it too, and often whinged that he had to churn stuff out just for the money. But he'd built himself a lifestyle that needed a constant stream of cash. The ranch, social commitments, and looking after family and mates. His own success ended up tying him up and pushing him to keep pumping stuff out. The more he wrote, the worse it got. The Beauty Ranch went from being a getaway to a bloody big burden. He kept on buying more land and kicking off new ventures, even though scientific farming meant taking on heaps of debts, machinery, and trying out different workers. Some of his experiments didn't work out, and the money troubles just got worse. He borrowed cash based on future earnings he expected, hoping his next book would fix everything, but it never happened. That pattern kept going right up until he died. According to Charmian, he was dreaming up new books, projects, and adventures even in his final moments. He always refused to accept limits. That was his greatest strength and his biggest flaw. He wouldn't compromise, slow down, or admit his health was failing. That approach gave us some amazing work, but it also killed him at the age of 40. The circumstances of his death were a bit mysterious. Officially, it was uremia kidney failure, but they suspected a morphine overdose. Whether it was on purpose or an accident, no one's sure. He'd been in a lot of pain and taken morphine regularly, which made it easy to mess up the dose or decide the suffering was just too much. Charmian reckoned it was an accident and a natural death. Maybe she really believed that, or maybe she was protecting his legacy. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that he died on 22 November 1916 in a little cottage on his property, surrounded by unfinished manuscripts, unpaid debts, and big plans that were never going to happen. Charmian found him and called for medical help, but it was too late. The bloke who'd survived the Klondike, Pacific voyages, poverty, and being locked up just couldn't get past his own body breaking down, or his own refusal to take a break. The funeral was low-key, a private cremation, and his ashes were buried on the ranch under a rock he'd chosen years earlier. It had a simple memorial stone, not some fancy monument. He'd knocked back conventional Christianity and didn't want any religious ceremony. All he wanted was a peaceful burial at the place he loved, the very ranch he'd driven into bankruptcy trying to make it better. His death made headlines around the world. Famous writer dead at 40. Condolences and tributes came flooding in, some genuine, others just out of obligation. Socialist magazines mourned a comrade. Adventure mags celebrated a storyteller. Literary reviews gave balanced assessments. Different blokes grabbed a bit of him and shone a light on different sides. All them interpretations totally covered up the real bloke. In her later years, Charmian looked after his estate, got his writings out there, and wrote up stories about their life together. She built a picture of Jack London the way she wanted everyone to remember him, as an explorer, a writer, and a bloke who loved life. Yeah, fair enough, it had some truth. But it wasn't the full yarn. She knew he was complex, but she went for a simpler version, for the crowd, for his lasting rep, and to keep shifting his books. His books kept selling through the 20s, the Great Depression, and the World War. Every era found something that mattered. Readers during the Depression picked up on that spirit of working together. Blokes reading during the war spotted survival tricks, and those after the war saw a getaway into the bush. The stories just shifted to suit what each mob needed. A work that sticks around is one that can cop all sorts of changes and still mean something to generation after generation. In the 60s, he got a fresh wave of interest. The counterculture grabbed his anti-authority attitude, and greenies took on his nature writings. Even with his faults, the New Left reckoned his socialist ideas were tops and turned him into a symbol of a rebellious American tradition. Even if it wasn't spot on, social movements need their iconic figures. London filled that role. Academic research got serious, theses got written, and major critical works came out. Researchers dug through archives and uncovered all the finer details that earlier bios had skipped. Race stuff, contradictions, and his personal shortcomings. A fuller picture of London came out. Not a hero, but more down to earth. And that stirred up some pushback. Supporters tried to keep the myth alive. Critics wanted to rip it apart. And his actual writing got a bit lost in the arguments about the man himself. But it was just regular readers who stuck with him, not the academics or critics. Everyday Aussies picking up copies of The Call of the Wild, White Fang, and The Sea Wolf. Those stories stayed powerful, hooked the crowd, and built worlds that people wanted to get lost in. In the end, that's what counted. Not what the academics thought or which side you were on. So the question of whether the books still pull in readers? Yeah, they did, and they still do. London's in a bit of a tricky spot right now. Some readers are put off by his racism, while others are drawn to his environmental awareness. His sympathy for the working class appeals to a few, but his social Darwinism turns others away. He's way too contradictory for a simple rating, too controversial for total praise, and too talented to be completely ignored. We've got to grapple with that complexity. We need to reckon that he was both brilliant and limited, progressive and reactionary, visionary and blind. His books are still in print, taught in class, made into films, and translated into languages he never would have guessed. His words keep traveling, reaching new readers and sparking fresh interpretation. What really sticks around is this legacy, not the bloke himself, nor his politics or theories. The stories themselves have characters that feel alive, and prose that's still powerful. Now a state park, the Beauty Ranch lets visitors explore the grounds, see the Wolf House ruins, and walk trails London once walked. It's an education center and a historic landmark, not a farm or a big agricultural experiment anymore. Just the place where a famous writer lived and died. That's at least honest. It preserves what actually existed, not some fantasy version, and the writing carries on. That's what stays. Everything else fades. The personality, the politics, the personal drama. But Buck's transformation remains. White Fang's journey goes on, and the guy freezing in the Yukon still grips readers. These stories go beyond their author, existing independently of his biography, beliefs, and shortcomings. When literature really works, that's what it does. It outlives its time, outlasts its creator, and finds new readers who bring fresh perspectives. London achieved that despite everything, despite his contradictions and failures, and despite his early death, he created something lasting. The work has survived. That's the ultimate measure, not the theory behind it, nor the author's intentions. Only what's on the page can we judge for sure. Have a think about what sticks around from an author. Nah, not their character or what they believed, but the exact words they put together, the pictures they brought to life, the moments they snagged. In London's stories, we meet Buck, reacting to the wild, and White Fang, who learns to trust a bloke whose fingers were too frozen to strike a match. Those moments are there regardless of the author's flaws. They still have an effect, even with London's opinions on race, economics, or how society's structured. That makes some people feel a bit uncomfortable. We like to think of our creators as heroes, and we want to give them full respect without any worries. London doesn't give us that luxury. Fair dinkum. The same goes for most writers. You've got to separate the art from the artist, and judge the work on its own,
not by who made it.
That's the only way forward. Readers today come across London differently than folks in the past did. We spot the racist biases they overlooked or excused, see the gender stereotypes they thought were normal, and recognize the colonial viewpoint they never questioned.
That doesn't make us any better, mate.
We've got our own blind spots, and future readers will pick up on stuff about our time that's invisible to us.
That's cultural evolution for you.
Every generation finds new issues in classic works, and new meanings in familiar lines.
Still, The Call of the Wild keeps grabbing audiences and builds that gut-level bond between people and animals.
It still captures something essential about nature and society that echoes down the years. You can cop to the novel's faults and still appreciate its impact.
Both realities are there together, and the same principle goes for getting a fire going.
This tale does a good job by setting people against nature, logic against gut feel, and showing how death's a dead cert in tough spots.
London nailed a deep truth about surviving and that delicate line.
The story that hones in on that line between living and dying in the bush doesn't give a toss about his other views. It runs on its own logic.
That's what we mean when we chat about literary worth.
The piece goes beyond where it started, works on its own, and keeps making an impact that sticks as society's rules change.
Not all of London's yarns get to that level. Some feel old hat, others are offensive, and some are just daggy.
But the best ones still deliver and do what literature's really for. Shifting our point of view, stirring up deep feels, and getting new ideas going. That brings us to the question,
How do we deal with dodgy classics? Give them the cold shoulder? Slap a warning on them? Chuck them out of the conversation altogether? There's no perfect fix. But scrubbing these works doesn't get rid of the issues they point out.
The racist bias that's clear as day in London stuff shows what America really thought back in the early 1900s. Acting like those ideas never existed ain't gonna help.
Getting the historical context doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it. London wrote his stuff in particular times in history. He soaked up clear cultural biases and passed them on in his writing. You can spot these things without pushing them, look at them closely without big noting them, and learn from them without repeating them. His socialist ideas were just as layered. He stood up for working-class rights. He backed the workers, got behind strikes, and wrote stories that showed the brutal truth about poverty, all real advanced for his era. But his socialism was mixed up with social Darwinism, believing in racial superiority, and thinking violence is just natural. These opposite ideas filled his head at the same time and show up in his work. We can't make him logically all of a piece.
There's no way to get rid of the contradictions or make him into the perfect hero we might have wanted.
What we're left with is the real bloke, his genuine beliefs, his actual work, and every bit of it's complex. Everything's tangled up together. Nothing's pure or simple. That truth's probably fair dinkum. People are full of contradictions. They've got heaps of sides to them, and they hold conflicting beliefs all at once. Take London. He was all for justice but okay with social classes. He loved nature but used it up. Backed the workers while chasing his own riches. Like everyone, he was stuffed up, disorganized, and all over the shop. His influence still shows up in some unexpected ways. Modern survival writers owe a heap to London, whether they know it or not. The genre he helped kick off keeps going, adapting and evolving, but the core setup stays. Bloke against nature, society against the bush. Those themes still strike a chord. Even environmental writers rate him despite his contradictions. His stuff on nature shaped how Americans see the wild, conservation, and the link between people and the land. Often not the way he pictured it, but a bloke's influence stretches way further than his original aims. The ranch he built is still standing. It's now a state park where visitors can have a wander and check out the ruins of the Wolf House. It's like a monument to his dreams, his stuff-ups, and his big ideas. The place itself keeps what was really there. No airbrushed version, just the real, unfinished, imperfect deal. His headstone's pretty modest. Out at Glen Ellen Cemetery, there's no flash or fancy stuff, just a name and dates, and that feels right. He wanted to be buried on his own land, to go back to the soil he'd worked. Even with all the hurdles and letdowns, his ashes were scattered on the land he loved. This place was his pick. He made it his home. Charmian outlived him by nearly 40 years, passing away in 1955. She kept his papers, stuck up for his legacy, wrote about their travels, and shaped how history would reckon with him. That's a huge amount of power. A widow calling the shots on history, deciding what gets talked up and what gets buried. She had her own motives, expectations, and her own take on what went down. In the end, the docs finished up at the Huntington Library, where researchers can check them out. They peeled back layers she'd kept hidden, spotted inconsistencies she'd missed, and showed a bloke way more fascinating than the legend. Less perfect, more relatable? Reckon that's about right. Truth generally comes out eventually. Archives don't lie as much as memories do, and the clearest thing is the whole body of work. 19 novels, 18 short story collections, and heaps of articles. A massive output in a pretty short career. Some bits are top-notch, some are average, some are bloody awful. But the sheer amount is mind-blowing. He wrote non-stop, churned out content like there was no tomorrow, kept at it through pain, sickness, and every hurdle. And you can't argue with that commitment. His best stuff still matters. The Call of the Wild, White Fang, The Sea Wolf, To Build a Fire, Martin Eden. These books aren't flawless, but they pack a real punch. They nail it. They build worlds, craft characters, and spin yarns that hook readers. That's a win, no matter what else the author might have done wrong. If he'd lived longer, would his writing have turned out differently? Hard to say. 40's still pretty young. He might have grown up, ditched his biases, seen new viewpoints, or gone the other way, got more rigid and doubled down on his existing ideas. We'll never find out. Dying at 40 froze him in time, stopping any change for better or worse. What's left is his real body of work, not what could have been. Same goes for any writer who kicks the bucket early. We reckon about missed chances, dream up books that never got written. But all we've got is the real deal, the actual books, the actual words. Everything else is just guesswork, wishful thinking, and us putting our own hopes onto what ain't there. Jack London's real legacy is solid. The published books, the stories that last, and the impact he's had on writers who came after. Not about hypothetical creations or possible wins, but what actually went down and what's still around. That's enough for a review, and then some. His own life turned into a legend. A poor kid who made it big, a self-taught bloke who mastered literature, ripper adventures in faraway lands, early recognition, and a tragic end. Dying young's almost too perfect a story, a bit too neat. Real life's messier, but the legend sticks around because it grabs you, because people want to believe it, because it gives them hope. That hope's real, even if the details are tricky. He really did escape poverty, educated himself, and had a win as a writer. Those truths still stand, despite all the discrepancies. They matter, especially for readers from similar backgrounds who see a shot in his journey and reckon they can do something like that too. In the end, the writing speaks for itself. You can enjoy Call of the Wild without knowing London's personal story. The novel works on its own, creates its own universe, tells its own yarn. A biography gives background and deepens understanding, but the book stands independent of that. It's got its own completeness, its own power. What's left is this: the printed words, the stories themselves. Everything else is fascinating, educational, worth knowing, but less important. The most important thing is the work, whether it still touches readers, makes an impact, and stays relevant. By that measure, London was a success. The books keep going, get read, are part of syllabuses and discussed. That's literary immortality. Not a spotless reputation or widespread adoration, but ongoing relevance, ongoing audience, ongoing existence. 4 decades weren't enough. He had more stories, ideas, and thoughts to share. But what he created in those 40 years beats what many authors do in twice the time, and his whole body of work is extraordinary. Even if the quality's up and down, it's often bloody impressive. No doubt about its impact. Jack London kicked the bucket on 22 November 1916, but his stuff lived on. The work survives. That's what matters and lasts. Not the author, but his writings, his language, his yarns don't fade. They keep pulling in readers and stay relevant. That's the real legacy, the only thing that counts. Artists are judged by what they produce, not by their intentions or potential, but by what they actually create. London wrote 50 books, plus hundreds of stories, essays, and journalism. A massive body of work he knocked out in 16 years as a pro writer, from age 22 to 40. That was all he had. He used it as best he could, but the contradictions stay unresolved, unsolvable. Both a child of his time and a rebel against it. He stood up for workers but exploited them on his own ranch, worshipped nature while he took advantage of it, and fought for equality while accepting hierarchies. These conflicts run right through his whole body of work. They make it harder to put him in a box, ignore him, or give him unconditional praise. Modern readers approach him carefully, aware of his racism, uncomfortable with his social Darwinism, but admiring his nature descriptions. Drawn to the adventure, we pick and choose what appeals and criticize what doesn't cut it. That's probably an honest take, better than uncritical praise or total rejection. His influence on American literature is undeniable, no matter how we personally judge him. He showed that working-class stories could be commercial hits, nature writing could be elevated to literature, and adventure novels could tackle intellectual themes. Other authors learned from his work and built on his foundation. The lineage of American adventure literature traces straight back to him. Despite his contradictions, the environmental movement claims him as one of their own. His portrayals of the wilderness shaped the American view of nature, conservation, and the role of humans in a vast ecosystem. His environmental commitment wasn't consistent. Nah, it really wasn't. But his lively prose brought the wilderness to life and got readers keen on places they'd never even visit. His brand of socialism never formed a lasting political movement, because it was too contradictory and tangled up with other ideologies. Still, The People of the Abyss stands as a powerful testament to poverty. As for poverty, the Iron Heel remains a prophetic warning against fascism, and those writings still matter, even if his overall political ideology lacks coherence. His personal journey still fascinates. Born out of wedlock, grew up poor, self-taught, chasing adventure, successful, then addicted, died young. That classic American arc from rags to riches and back down. We keep coming back to his story to understand his motivations, his failures, and his achievements against all odds. Beauty Ranch remains a monument to his grand ambitions. The ruins of Wolf House show the gap between his dreams and reality, while the cottage where he died serves as a reminder of human mortality. Physical places often hold truths that a biography might skip over. His ambitions were too big, his health too frail, and his lifespan too short. Charmian's part deserves credit. She preserved what was important, defended his writings, and made sure his books stayed available. With her biography, she shaped his legacy and introduced him to new readers. That's a big contribution. A literary executor who truly appreciated the value of what she was protecting. In the end, it's the books themselves that matter. The Call of the Wild still sells because Buck's transformation still strikes a chord with readers. White Fang stays popular because the shift from wildness to domestication conveys an emotional truth. To Build a Fire grips audiences because survival stories tap into a basic human instinct. These aren't just historical relics. They're living works that still pack a punch. We can't portray London as flawless, nor can we erase his faults or justify his prejudices. We can't fool ourselves by believing in the hero he sometimes made himself out to be. But we can still acknowledge his achievements. Steady yarns, powerful prose, and the influence on later writers make up a fair dinkum legacy worth hanging on to. Even though it's complex, this work deserves a good study and a read. Each generation reinterprets London in its own way, finding new meaning in classic writings and highlighting different bits. Our time recognizes the racism earlier mobs missed and picks up on environmental themes they overlooked. It gives a fair go to the working-class perspective that was taken for granted. Future readers will discover things we're missing now. That's how literature works. It keeps revealing new layers over time. His death at 40 robbed us of more works. We can only reckon what he might have done with more time, more maturity, and more distance from his early beliefs. At the moment of his end, his development was on the up. His best works came later in his career. Martin Eden and John Barleycorn. He was still developing as an artist through his later short stories, still in the making. Then it all stopped. How he died is less important than the simple fact that he croaked. Whether the morphine overdose was on purpose or by accident doesn't change the outcome. He died young, his body buggered by years of excess, kidney failure, and unbearable pain. His end was probably unavoidable. Only the exact time was uncertain. He was buried on beloved land, his ashes scattered over the ranch he built at great personal cost, even sending himself broke. That decision says a fair bit. Despite setbacks, disappointments, and knowing his farming dreams were futile, he chose that place, made it his home, and wanted to stay there forever. The burial site has a modest headstone, no flash monument, just his name and the years he lived. That's fair dinkum for someone who knocked back conventional religion and wanted a no-fuss return to the earth, his body become an earth again. And so it happened. His flesh rotted, while his creations live on in changed form. The books hung in there. Words that got printed over and over, translated into heaps of languages and read by millions. Something London never saw coming. His influence took off in a way he never could have imagined. That's what literary survival means. It's not about the bloke being remembered, but the work keeping on. We have a squiz at London because he's important, not perfect, not without dramas, but pretty bloody impressive. His books shaped how Americans reckon about the bush, adventure, class struggle, and surviving. These achievements are the real deal, even if his faults make things a bit messy. Teaching his stuff means you gotta have the background. Students need to get the racism, social Darwinism, and the contradictions. But they also gotta wrestle with the prose, live the story, and feel how the best bits still hit home. Education's about both critical analysis and aesthetic appreciation. One on its own just doesn't cut it. The legacy's as mixed up as the bloke in his books. Nothing spotless, nothing straightforward. Brilliant writing mixed with dodgy ideology, genuine insight muddled with deliberate prejudice. Knowing the environment but still exploiting it. We gotta deal with it all. Can't just neatly split the good from the bad. We've gotta wrestle with the complexity. Seems fair enough. Great writers are rarely straightforward blokes. Their work shows their contradictions, and their brilliance sits right next to their flaws. London's the perfect example, makes it unavoidable, and makes us face the truth that top-notch writing doesn't need moral purity. His books will outlast all the chatter about him today. The Call of the Wild will still be read long after no one remembers us. The arguments about whether he was racist, sexist, or whatever will die down eventually. But Buck's journey will keep going. The story's got its own life beyond the author's flaws, stands on its own 2 feet, and has real value. When books are a hit, they stick around way past their time, live on past the author, and keep bringing in new readers with fresh takes. London wrote something that was bigger than him, slipped out of his hands, and keeps growing, changing, and staying important. A life that covered 40 years, with 16 of those spent writing, churning out 50 books, heaps of pages, and influencing heaps of writers and readers. That's the tally. That's what's left behind. His legacy ain't perfect, but it's bloody significant. He wasn't some flawless hero, just a writer whose stuff still holds up. These days, Beauty Ranch is pretty quiet. Visitors wander the tracks, snap pics of the ruins, check out the museum, and learn about the bloke who used to call this place home. He dreamt and died right here on this land. The place he wanted to change outlived him, fought his plans, and ended up holding his bones. The land keeps going without him. Reckon that's a fair enough ending. The bloke goes back to the earth, while his work carries on in the world. His stories grab new readers. Over time, his legacy gets more complex, richer, less romanticized, and more real. Jack London died on the 22nd of November, 1916. His books still stand. That's the only thing that matters, the only thing that's left.